Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is tackling a really significant chapter from a major psychiatric textbook, focusing specifically on what we now call gambling disorder.
And it's crucial we do this. For so long, pathological gambling was sort of dismissed, wasn't it, as a moral weakness or sinfulness.
Right.
But the source material we're looking at today, this dedicated chapter, it really forces us to confront it for what it is. A serious, often devastating medical illness.
Yeah.
I mean, the impact it can have on someone's life, their family, their job.
Yeah.
It's often right up there with major addictions or chronic mental health conditions. It really needs to be seen as a public health concern.
And the sheer scale is just...
Wow.
The chapter mentions that in the U.S. alone, licensed and illicit gambling profits are maybe several $100 billion.
That's huge.
Yeah, potentially close to 1% of the entire U.S. GNP. And worldwide. Estimates are like $250 billion to $500 billion. So today we're going to walk you through how this understanding evolved, starting with the history, then the specific criteria doctors use now, the surprising brain science behind it, and finally, how it's treated. Okay, so gambling itself. It's not new. It seems like it's been around forever in pretty much every culture.
Absolutely. But what's really interesting looking at the source is where it seems to have started. It wasn't just about, having fun or making money initially.
Oh.
Well, the chapter points to origins in divination,
Right.
trying to figure out what the gods wanted or what the future held. Practices like sortilege, basically, interpreting patterns from throwing sticks or bones randomly.
So those like knuckle bone things you hear about, those were the early dice.
Exactly. The astragali sheep or goat knuckle bones, they found them in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Rome. Emperors, regular folks, they were all apparently avid dice players. And then cards came along in the 15th century, things like early Italian decks, which tarot evolved from, and those quickly got used for gambling too. Eventually, governments clued in.
Ah, the tax man cometh.
Pretty much. Venice apparently founded the first legitimate casinos in Europe, and you can bet the Doge took a very healthy percentage.
So it was all fate and luck for centuries.
Yeah.
But then math enters this scene, right? And suddenly it's less about luck and maybe more about odds, control.
That's the pivot point. You had Girolamo Cardano in the 15th century, a doctor, but also, interestingly, a pathological gambler himself, who started applying probability theory to games.
Wow.
Then Blaise Pascal, 17th century, famously studied probability, even while designing something that was a precursor to the roulette wheel. Once people like them showed outcomes weren't just random, that you could analyze them well. Psychiatry had to figure out what the compulsive gambling fit. Was it just bad choices or something more?
And for a long time, the official diagnosis kind of reflected that uncertainty. Pathological gambling used to be stuck under impulse control disorders in the DSM-III, DSM-IV.
Right, which always felt a bit inadequate, maybe, given how destructive it could be. It didn't quite capture the addictive nature.
Exactly.
And that's where the big change happened with the DSM-V. Based on a lot of solid clinical research, neurobiology too, they formally renamed it gambling disorder.
Oh.
And crucially, they moved it. It's now in a category called non-substance related disorders. This was basically psychiatry saying, yes, this functions like an addiction. It belongs alongside alcohol and drug dependence conceptually. So now that it's officially an addiction, let's talk about how it's actually diagnosed. The DSM-V lays out 9 criteria. You need to meet at least 4 of these within a 12-month period.
9 criteria. Okay.
And they kind of cover 3 main areas: issues with control, the sort of obsessive aspect, and the negative consequences.
Is that cycle you hear about needing more excitement, feeling bad when you stop? That sounds like classic addiction withdrawal.
It really is. The first few criteria hit that directly. Needing to bet more and more money to get the same thrill. Feeling restless, irritable if you try to cut back or stop, and making repeated but unsuccessful attempts to control it.
Okay, so that's the control part.
Right.
What about the obsession?
Right, the next criteria cover that. Being totally preoccupied with gambling, thinking about past bets, planning future ones, figuring out handicaps, then gambling when feeling down, using it to escape anxiety or depression. And then there's the real core pathology, what clinicians often call chasing losses, that desperate need to go back and gamble more to try and win back what you've lost.
Right, just one more win trap.
Exactly. And the final 3 criteria really focus on the damage it causes.
The fallout.
Yes. Lying to family, friends, therapists about how much you're gambling, jeopardizing or actually losing important relationships, maybe your job, or educational opportunities because of it. And finally, relying on others for money to deal with the financial mess caused by gambling, basically escalating the search for bailout money.
That's a pretty comprehensive picture. And there's a key point about diagnosis, too, right? It can't just be during a manic episode.
That's a crucial distinction. If the gambling only happens during mania, it's considered part of the bipolar disorder, not a separate gambling disorder. It shows why getting the diagnosis right is so important. And the severity, mild, moderate, severe, that just depends on how many of the 9 criteria someone meets.
Now, who actually develops this? The textbook suggests the picture is changing quite a bit. It used to be seen as like a middle-aged white guy problem.
That was the old stereotype, yeah. But the epidemiology now shows it cuts across pretty much every ethnic group, social class, age, you name it. Prevalence is estimated around 0.5% to 1% for the full pathological criteria, maybe 2% to 3% for problem gambling.
And accessibility seems key. The book mentions a direct link between casinos opening and rates going up.
Absolutely. That's a really stark finding in the research cited. When a new casino opens, the prevalence of problem and pathological gambling in that local area tends to increase, sometimes up to 3% within about 3 to 5 years.
Wow.
So access matters. And while it affects everyone, certain groups seem to be at higher risk now.
Like who?
Well, the source mentions the poor, especially minority groups. Adolescents and young adults' peer pressure, plus how easy it is to gamble online now.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And also the elderly, retirees, maybe people who are more isolated or homebound. And there are gender differences too. Women tend to start gambling later than men, typically.
Okay.
But the chapter notes that once women do develop pathological gambling, the progression can be faster. And unfortunately, rates of suicidality appear to be significantly higher compared to men with the disorder.
Okay, let's unpack the typical path someone might take into this. It often starts pretty young, maybe in adolescence.
Often, yes.
Well,
But a really common element, according to the text, is an early, big win. Maybe unexpected, maybe just lucky.
the hook.
Exactly. It can create this powerful, false sense of, hey, I'm good at this, or I have special insight, an illusion of control, really.
And contrary to maybe the stereotype of a gambler being lazy, the chapter says they're often actually hardworking people.
That's an important point. They're often described as quite committed, energetic, good providers, at least initially. They aren't necessarily shirking responsibility. Sometimes they're using that work ethic to desperately try and juggle the financial chaos the gambling creates.
But then things start to slide. Maybe stress hits, or they find a new way to gamble, like online or a casino opens nearby.
Right. The losses start mounting. And instead of stopping, which would be the rational thing, they double down. They start chasing losses.
That phrase again, it seems central.
It is. It's the engine of the disorder. And that chase inevitably leads them down a path of exhausting every single source of money.
Savings, credit cards.
Family loans, borrowing legally, then maybe illegally. The chapter mentions seeking out loan sharks who charge these incredibly high interest rates, sometimes called the vigorish or the VIG. And the end point is often devastating. Public humiliation, maybe job loss, professional disgrace, divorce, even potential imprisonment or suicide. If they commit crimes, and it's often things like embezzlement or fraud, it's usually not sophisticated. It's typically petty, desperate acts just to get money to keep gambling and cover the immediate hole.
The source material really emphasizes this concept of action. It sounds like more than just wanting to gamble. It's like a craving for the experience itself.
It is. It's described as this overwhelming, almost physical pull. The gambler feels intensely alive when they're in action. The book quotes Dostoevsky, who knew this firsthand, calling it le jeu pour le jeu, the game for the game's sake.
So winning isn't even the main goal anymore.
In a way, no. Winning just becomes fuel for more action. They might even start playing games they know nothing about just to stay in action, which of course usually makes the losses worse. The rationalization is always, I need to catch up, but the underlying drive is just for the rush.
And they become experts at juggling money, hiding things.
Oh, absolutely. The chapter talks about how they become masters of manipulating cash flow, moving money around. That itself becomes part of the excitement, part of the action. But it comes at a cost. They tend to lose the ability to think about the future. They get trapped in this kind of eternal present, just focused on the next bet, the next session. Personality-wise, in pure form, they're often described as competitive, maybe intelligent, but not deeply intellectual, overly confident, relentless optimists, masters of denial, and often alexithymic.
Alexithymic, what's that?
It means having difficulty identifying and expressing your own emotions. They might feel things intensely, but they can't really put words to it or even recognize it themselves.
So moving from what it looks like to why it happens. We've left behind the simple moral failing idea. The chapter looks at psychological theories and then gets into the brain science. What did the early psychoanalysts think?
Well, Freud weighed in, naturally. In his essay on Dostoevsky from 1928, he actually suggested pathological gambling might stem from displaced childhood masturbatory urges. He saw the frantic hand movements, the drivenness, as kind of autoerotic equivalents.
Okay, that's certainly a Freudian take. Probably not the go-to explanation today.
Not really, no, but it opened the door to thinking about it psychologically. A much more influential early theory came from Edmund Burglar.
Burglar, right. His idea was quite counterintuitive, wasn't it? That gamblers secretly want to lose.
Exactly. Burglar argued that the pathological gambler is driven by this deep, unconscious need to lose. Why? Because of guilt, often stemming from repressed aggression towards authority figures, think bad mother or lady luck.
So the pain of losing is actually fulfilling some need.
In Burglar's view, yes, the suffering becomes almost eroticized, a form of self-punishment that satisfies that subconscious guilt. It's a powerful theory, even if hard to prove definitively.
But now science can actually look inside the brain. What are the imaging studies telling us? Is there a physical difference?
There seems to be. The chapter describes findings showing potential damage or compromised function in key brain areas related to judgment, decision-making, and impulse control, specifically the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Similar to what's seen in substance use disorders, there's this tendency to prioritize short-term rewards over long-term consequences. But the really compelling evidence involves the brain's reward system, specifically dopamine.
Ah, dopamine.
Yeah.
The feel-good chemical.
Right. There seems to be dysregulation in the dopamine pathways in the mesolimbic system, which drives motivation and reward-seeking behavior.
And there's clinical evidence for this dopamine connection, isn't there? Something about Parkinson's disease.
Yes, this is a striking piece of evidence highlighted in the text. About 1/3 of Parkinson's patients who are treated with dopamine agonist drugs, specifically designed to boost dopamine activity, actually develop pathological gambling, even if they had no history of it before.
Wow, so just changing the brain chemistry can trigger it.
It strongly suggests dopamine plays a critical role. It provides pretty definitive support for the neurobiological model.
And this brain difference might explain why gamblers are so prone to, weird thinking patterns, cognitive biases.
Absolutely. If your reward system is wired differently, you're much more vulnerable to distorted thinking. The classic example is the gambler's fallacy.
That's the idea that if you've lost 10 times in a row, you're due for a win.
Precisely. It's this completely irrational but deeply held belief that past random events influence future ones, especially after a near miss that really reinforces the fallacy. And casinos, well...
They know this.
Oh, they know this very well. The chapter points out how casino environments are deliberately designed with stimuli, the lights, the sounds, the comps, to exploit these cognitive vulnerabilities and encourage people, especially vulnerable ones, to bet over their head, not with it, as the saying goes.
And we can't forget comorbidity. Gambling disorder often doesn't show up alone, right?
Right. Very true. The research consistently shows high rates of comorbidity. Major depression, bipolar disorder are very common. Substance use disorders too, alcohol, cocaine, nicotine dependence. And ADHD is also significantly linked, both in adolescents and adults, with gambling problems.
Okay, so it's complex. It involves psychology, brain chemistry, powerful environmental triggers. How do you treat it? The chapter mentions it's tough to even get people into treatment.
That's a major hurdle. Only about 10% to 20% of people with pathological gambling ever seek professional help. And when they do, it's often only because of extreme pressure, like their spouse threatens divorce or they're facing legal charges.
So what works for those who do seek help?
An integrated approach is usually best. The strongest evidence currently supports cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, that helps people identify their triggers, challenge those distorted thoughts like the gambler's fallacy, and find healthier ways to cope or get rewards. Motivational interviewing is also key, helping build the person's own motivation to change.
What about medication? Can that help?
Yes, pharmacology can be quite valuable, especially given the high rates of comorbidity. SSRI antidepressants, bupropion, Some mood stabilizers like lithium or lamotrigine, and even opioid antagonists like naltrexone have all shown some success in studies mentioned in the text.
Naltrexone, that's used for alcohol and opioid addiction too, right?
It is. It seems to help reduce cravings. Often, treating an underlying depression or anxiety with medication can significantly reduce the urge to gamble as well. But one note of caution. Benzodiazepines, like Valium or Xanax, are generally avoided because of their own high potential for addiction.
Makes sense. And then there's self-help.
Absolutely. Gamblers Anonymous GA plays a huge role. It's that international 12-step fellowship structured very much like Alcoholics Anonymous. Peer support is crucial.
But the chapter mentioned a challenge with GA too, something about bailouts.
Yeah, the dropout rate can be high. One specific issue noted is that if someone gets a financial bailout, maybe family pays off their debts, the immediate crisis feels over.
So the motivation to go to meetings fades.
Exactly. The thinking becomes, well, I don't have debts anymore, so I don't have a problem. Which, of course, ignores the underlying addiction. It's a tricky dynamic.
Lastly, what about the legal side? You mentioned people sometimes commit crimes. How does the system handle that?
Traditionally, it's mostly been about punishment, jail time, fines. But the chapter notes that experts are increasingly advocating for diversion programs, similar to drug courts.
So treatment instead of jail.
Basically, yes. Offering mandated treatment and a plan for restitution, paying back the money as a condition of probation, rather than just locking someone up. The argument is that jail might stop the gambling temporarily and sort of act like a disguised bailout by pausing the financial pressure, but it doesn't treat the actual addiction.
Right.
Meanwhile, the gaming industry itself is in a complex spot, funding some research, allowing people to self-bar from casinos, but obviously still needing to make a profit. It's a tough balance. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into the textbook chapter, the big takeaway is that gambling disorder is now firmly recognized as an addiction in the DSM-III. It's not just bad habits.
Right.
It's defined by those specific diagnostic criteria, especially that relentless drive for action and the destructive pattern of chasing losses. And the why seems to be a mix of deep psychological factors like burglar's idea of wanting to lose, combined with very real differences in brain function, particularly involving dopamine. And treatment needs to reflect that complexity using tools like CBT, maybe medication for co-occurring issues, and the vital support of groups like GA.
I think a final thought from this material really is about resistance. This illness is incredibly difficult to treat, largely because the person suffering from it is often so incredibly resistant to admitting they have a problem and actually getting help. And looking ahead, with online and virtual gambling likely to just keep expanding globally, well, figuring out how to identify people early and get them help is going to be even more critical, but also maybe even harder. The challenge remains really significant.
It really does. If you or someone you know might be struggling with gambling, please know that help is available. A key resource mentioned is the National Council on Problem Gambling. Their national helpline number is 1-800-GAMBLER. That's 1-800-GAMBLER. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into the psychiatric view of gambling disorder.